And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Indonesia's Bali hosts the G20 summit this year with a mission to work on recovery together, recovery stronger. G20 leaders gather as the world economy reels from geopolitical tensions, high inflation due in part to rising food and energy costs, and unbridled climate change. Could leaders set aside their differences and focus on the common good? Could China and the U.S. work together as responsible major powers toward effective global governance? On these questions and more, answers from a strong panel on World Insight's special edition on the G20 summit. The G20 gathers the world's largest economies, both from the developed and the developing world. Will those at the G20 summit be able to put aside their differences, demonstrate their leadership, and focus on the common good? How could Asian wisdom help with that process? All eyes on Bali, a strong panel making sense of them all. With me, Tian Wei, on World Insight. For more on the G20 summit, in Bishkek, Jomart Otobayev, former Prime Minister of Kyrgyzstan. In New York, Daniel Russell, Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at Asia Society Policy Institute. In Beijing, Alessandro Teixeira, former Minister of Development, Industry and Foreign Trade in Brazil. In Indonesia, Muhadi Sugirno, international relations expert with Indonesia's Hashdamada University. In Vancouver, Svaran Singh, visiting professor at Department of Political Science in University of British Columbia. Last but not least, in Beijing, Xie Tao, professor and dean of the School of International Relations and Diplomacy with Beijing Foreign Studies University. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to see all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. This year, G20 summit promised to recover together and recover stronger. Now, Prime Minister Otobayev, how much do you see that goal is likely to be met by the top leadership meeting?
All humanity put a lot of hopes for G20 because it's very influential. It's contained the countries of something like 80% of world economy. We are all recovering from this terrible COVID situation. And actually, reaction of G20 to the COVID-19 in 2021 were very good. I remember very well, especially the kind of prolongation of the debt situation for developing countries. Absolutely unusual and timely measure, which G20 decided to postpone the debt payment of the most needy country around the world, that the amount of resources will be devoted to the fight against COVID-19. So now it's time focusing on real multilateralism and making planet safer place for all human beings.
True multilateralism. Minister Teixeira, is that likely to be achieved? What's your expectation?
My expectation is that we're going to walk through a path of multilateralism. It's very important for every single country. And I think the message, the theme that Indonesia took over recover together and recover stronger shows that there is only one way to get out of the situation that you have, or in the COVID-19 and also in the economic crisis that we are getting to, is working together. We know for sure right now, after almost 3 years of COVID, there is not one single solution, Chen-Wen. We need to work together. We need a better governance. And this is the answer for recovery of COVID. This is the answer for climate change. And this is the answer for economic development. There is no other way.
Expectation seems to be high, gentlemen, among you. What about for you, Mr. Russell?
The G20 was born in crisis, the global financial meltdown. And today it's faced with a whole host of crises, as been mentioned: health, climate crisis, economic crisis, debt crisis, the crisis of major power rivalry, of the attack on sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So this is a moment when the 20 largest economies and influential powers have to discharge their obligation to the world. So it's not about hope, it's about responsibility.
Professor Xie, your thoughts about what can be expected?
It's very hard to say what kind of expectations we have right now. But I think all the previous speakers have already mentioned that the international community is really hoping that the 20 most powerful economies would work hand in hand to address some of these urgent issues like debt crisis, health crisis, etc. But I think the eyes will mostly be on the two most influential players right now, the United States of America and China. And so that's why, in China here too, you can see there's a lot of expectations about our president's first ever overseas trip after the 20th Party Congress.
So you are saying that the bilateral interactions between China and the United States is going to add so much hope or provide so much unpredictability to the results of the G20? Is that what you're trying to say?
More or less so, Tianwei. I think the expectation is that the two countries' leaders will indeed sit down at least and talk to each other and try to find out what are the concerns and issues between the two major powers. We all know that without an active and constructive contribution from the two powers, there is hardly anything that could be done in a short time and in a meaningful way. To have true multilateralism, you do have countries that would take the lead to get other countries on board, contributing to the international prosperity and security.
All right. Mr. Singh, please, your thoughts.
I think the first good news is that after almost 3 years, leaders and their delegations have a chance to meet face to face. And in such circumstances, a lot more can be achieved. And I think there's a new enthusiasm of meeting in person. Second good news is that the 15-16 G20 summit is being preceded by the East Asian summit and followed by APEC summit, which gives them larger amount of leeway and time to sort of build consensus and build mutual understandings. The third good news, I think, is also the fact that, we have just crossed a very difficult time of pandemic, and I think we are almost hoping that some kind of fatigue is now showcasing in Ukraine crisis. And in that scenario, both the President of the United States and President of China are arriving to the G20 summit after domestic scenario being little stabilized after midterm elections and transition in China. And therefore, I think the greater expectations are natural to expect from here. And in that sense, I assume that they will be able to clinch some solutions to some continuing problems, particularly the 4 Fs, which is fuel, food, fertilizer, and now finance, being in crisis. And I think that is where these nations have to come to some kind of consensus. Very quick last point, I want to say slightly differently from what Xie Tao just mentioned. I understand there is an enormous weightage to how leaders of United States and China engage with each other, but world is also aware of their constant contestations. And I think that will create a greater space for the mid-ranking economies among emerging economies to kind of help build consensus and create cushions where they can see some kind of contestation between the two big, United States and China, can be brought to some kind of an understanding in making sure that initiatives can be taken forward.
For this round, I need to go to the host country of the G20, Mr. Sugiono. Of course, Indonesia has been working on this for quite some time. A lot of challenges, and everybody understands the depth of it. So what about the goal of recover together, recover stronger? How much is their expectation for that from the host country?
Yes, I think with regard to the G20 this year, there are challenges, expectation, and responsibilities. here the competition between China and the US, the Ukraine war have created a problem for the meeting. Even before the meeting started, there has been a row with regard to whether or not we need to invite Putin or Russia in the meeting. Although finally the Indonesian government decided we keep on inviting everyone to come to the meeting. And this reflects quite clearly the principle that Indonesia would like to put forward as the president of the G20. That is, we need to make use of this meeting as a forum for multilateralism, because Indonesia believes that multilateralism is highly needed.
Everybody is very grateful for the hard work that Indonesia and the Indonesian government has been doing over the past year in order to make all of the possibilities happen under the very difficult circumstances. Let's go into some of the important newsworthy details. One of it is the bilateral meeting between the Chinese and the American presidents. We understand that both countries are likely to meet the top leadership at this G20. How much do you see, Mr. Russell, the bilateral interactions, the first face-to-face interaction in a multilateral context, likely to help China and the United States to be able to go through some of the important issues bilaterally and also for the world?
That's such a great question, Tianwei. The fact that Presidents Biden and Xi Jinping are meeting in the context of the G20 immediately after the East Asia Summit, in the run-up, and I should say also after COP27 and in the run-up to APEC, is a way of framing the bilateral relationship so as to remind them that they have a heavy responsibility to the international community. I'm hopeful that they will hear the voices of the international community saying, not only do we not want to choose between China or the United States, we demand that China and the United States cooperate to fulfill their responsibilities to planet Earth.
Professor Xie, your thoughts?
The two leadership meeting at the sidelines of a truly multilateral setting, that shows that they are both committed to working together with the rest of the members on many of these urgent issues. I think, right now within China, there's this strong perception that the Biden administration is pushing hard on the kind of science and technology war, maybe you can use that word, to confront China. And so that will put a lot of this shadow over the two leaders meeting. I think, with the midterm election results coming out, Biden may feel a little bit emboldened because his party has done far better than he expected. And so I think, maybe he would continue to push on these technological sanctions like AI technology against the Chinese companies. That would make the situation even worse. But regardless, I think I agree with you and the other speakers. These very important multilateral context for the two leaders to meet more or less show that they are indeed committed to multilateralism. And they do understand, like Mr. Russell said, the responsibilities that the two countries share for the rest of the world.
Just one more thing about the bilateral in a multilateral context. We understand there are different priorities. Some say it's not going to be any agreement. Others suggest that it is more about the red line rather than, the higher expectations about the future. But there are also issues that are concrete, certainly preventing bilateral relations from going to a more smoother path, which will also have a huge impact on the global issue, for example, supply chains and etc. So how do you see the two leadership likely to add their flavor to all of these entangled conversations?
This is not a typical negotiation between two world leaders who have host of difficult issues to resolve. This is an opportunity for two leaders who actually know each other quite well, but haven't been able to meet in person for several years, and whose countries are facing very difficult strategic confrontation to try to begin laying out their own priorities, their own global views, in an effort to start a process to reduce tensions and to empower cooperation on important issues. I don't think that we should expect big deliverables or the resolution of outstanding problems, but I do think that the fact that they are at the G20 is going to help them focus on what each can do and what both can do together in support of a multilateral effort to address the most pressing financial debt and economic and supply chain challenges that are on the agenda of the G20 itself.
Prime Minister Atabbayev, what do you think are the expectations coming from international community for the two leaders of China and the United States be able to sit down together, or even if they talk to each other in the corridor? What are people's expectations? What kind of responsibilities should they fulfill?
So what everybody wanted around the world these days is a peace and sustainable cooperation between two great powers. I don't expect that it will be huge breakthroughs, but the fact that people, leaders are meeting and communicating and shaking hands, very important. It's good signal to responding apparatuses to start to find a way how to do things better. In technology, for example, for US, it's very important to understand that putting all kinds of barriers is too late. Too late. China already made breakthrough everywhere. The last bastions which China overcome is semiconductors. Now China is producing 5 nanometers chips, which is top of the world achievements, making break through research and development fundamental sciences. So it's too late to stop and to contain China. Instead, let's go for cooperation. Step by step, asking their responsible institutions in military, in science, in economy, in other places to speak to each other. And one of the first should be to get together think tanks, professorships, academic exchange, open debates. Everybody will benefit out of it. It will be the first step of building trust. Like Confucius said, if there is lack of trust, there is no any other things you can do. So building trust step by step is most important matter in terms of this bilateral meeting.
Mr. Teixeira, we see the midterm election in the United States. We also see China just wrap up its very important once every 4 or 5 years political meeting. We also see in Brazil, the new administration comes out. So we see quite a number of cases among the G20 economies that there is likely to be some predictability politically for the next few years to go. What does that provide, this multilateral platform with space to maneuver?
I think, Chen, when your question is very complex in answer. First of all, we cannot be naive and think that the situation between US and China will change, because we will not. Because it's not a foreign affairs issue, it's an internal political issue. When we are seeing that you have this rivalry between China and United States, for American politics is very important to have that, because you can steer the government, you can get more resources for the budget. So this is the situation there. What is new? And I think that's what your question focuses is about, the multilateral. United States as a developed country and China as a developing country, they have responsibilities. They are two largest economies with voices from different perspectives. And the G20 for always, since 1955, when we start discussing these elements, has in one side the developing countries and the other side the developed countries. If we see the agenda that is set, talking about COVID, talking about digital transformation, talking about climate change, of course, there is contradictions between developed countries and developing countries. So I think we need to put and frame the relations of China and the United States under these conditions. That's very important. And I think we cannot just give it away and take for granted that this situation.
Do you expect, Mr. Teixeira, if I could, it seems that there's some undertone in your answer. Do you expect, as a result of that, much debate between the developing and the developed economies within G20? Is that going to be a fierce battle, quote unquote? You know, media like to exaggerate things, but you know, are there signs of that for this particularly G20 meeting?
I don't think it's going to be a first, but we're going to see in COP27 right now the debate about responsibility with developing countries. This is a big element in climate change. This is a big element in finance the development. This is a big element in poverty reduction, in hunger. So there is a tension in that situation, and that was caused in the last G7 meeting. So that's a very important element. And I think together with China, we have India, we have Brazil. The next two countries to lead the G20 in the future is going to be India and Brazil. So the situation is going to be following up because there is a lot of responsibilities that we need to discuss.
Okay. Among the topics to be discussed, gentlemen, we know there's going to be climate change. What's left going to be, what is the leftover or the carry on of the discussion at the COP27? We also understand that that issue among the developing economies likely to be a question. Meanwhile, we are also seeing, you know, the inflation issue, and some even talked about the dollar issue. How does that is going to be dribbling down to other economies? After all, G20 is one that is founded with the possibility to resolve the global financial crisis back in 2008. So among all of these topics, what are likely to be the most important one that you would love to hold on to, multilateral topics I'm talking about here? So let me go to Mr. Singh from India.
Thank you, Tianwei. I think climate finance, to me, appears to be the most ticklish issue here, which is going to create contestations and create that divide between developing and developed economies, because that's a irritant which is continuing for a long period of time. Developed world has not delivered on the promises of either climate mitigation fund or transfer of technology. And now in face of 3 years of pandemic, and of course the continuing Ukraine crisis, which is seeing much of the European countries spending more money on weapons, I think they will now push for their protectionist postures much more. And instead of even giving a lip service that they will potentially do something, or they understand that they have not been able to do something, we will see them really relenting or not relenting on cooperating and coming on their commitments. And final point, I think this deficit of energy is pushing much of the world, including both the developed and developing nations, back into fossil fuels. So in that sense, even the promises that are made by developing countries, for example, India has agreed to achieve zero net carbon emission by 2070. Now, you know, that kind of commitments could also come under pressure. And I think therefore climate change is going to be a big issue, and climate financing, climate justice will be issues which will be great irritation in this meeting, according to my understanding.
Mr. Prime Minister?
I think that agenda of sustainable development will be a very efficient point to discussion, because in the world there is a consensus about the way how we have to save the planet. However, what is happening is that with the current investments in the sustainable development, the world will not go into the carbon neutrality to 2050 or 2060. World should be much more united in that respect. In that respect, leading countries, G20, have special responsibility to have leadership, to provide leadership to around the world, how to increase investments into sustainable development. In that respect, we need political statement from G20 that these joint efforts will continue. Such great ideas like ESG agenda on environment, social and governance would have another push from politicians. So corporate world is gradually but decisively move into this direction. So it will be much better investments into green area, less to the fossil fuels. We have to look for the green energy. And again, we're coming to technology. So technology should be joint efforts to work together. Western countries should not impose any duties for competition in green development. Why they do it?
Okay.
It should not be. So here we must work together. And again, I would like also to confirm that the debt situation around the world is going to be unsustainable, and China should go for the debates with institutions like Paris Club and London Club to establish universal sets of rules on debt management around the world.
Minister Teixeira.
I think if we go back to September and we saw the main speech of the General Secretary of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, when he states that we didn't achieve and we're far away to achieve any of the 17 sustainable development goals that every single country in the world agree upon, we see that we are in a very difficult situation. That's why I think the main discussion is about sustainable and inclusive growth. And of course, the limitations that we have, as Prime Minister just mentioned, to achieve any kind of commitment with low carbon economy by 2050, 2060. So really, really serious. We have many, many problems that, again, goes back to the title of Indonesia took for G20. We cannot solve these problems bilaterally or singly. We need to solve them together, and we need to be sure that the answer for those problems is not the small countries, is not the developing countries, is for the world. Because if we don't change the path of sustainable growth and inclusive growth, if we don't change climate change, we probably are looking for to shorten the life of our human race in many years. So that's a very, very important issue to be discussed.
I see the passion among many of you about that question. Now, also, Professor Xie, what do you see as should be the most important topics to be discussed?
I would say probably climate change. You mentioned that we're on the eve of the COP27. And in fact, many of these countries that you mentioned about that are trapped in debt crisis, they are also unusually bearing the disproportionate cost of climate change, poverty and climate change negative consequences. So these two issues are closely related to each other. But at the end of the day, I agree with the speakers, but I think at the end of the day, all the leaders at G20, APEC, in ASEAN or COP27, they must demonstrate that they have the political will to go back home, educate their own public and the political rivals and factions about the importance and the urgency of climate change.
All right. Gentlemen, stay with me. We're going to continue our discussion on the upcoming G20 summit in just a minute.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
The G20
gathers the world's largest economies, both from the developed and the developing world. Will those at the G20 summit be able to put aside their differences, demonstrate their leadership, and focus on the common good? How could Asian wisdom help with that process? All eyes on Bali, a strong panel making sense of them all, with me, Tian Wei, on World Insight.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We're focusing on the G20 summit this month. The G20 is a platform for the world's largest economies to work together in fixing financial and economic challenges. And as a guide for effective global governance, it happens that next year, 2023, marks the 70th anniversary of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence raised by former Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. So what does Asian history tell us about wisdom in governance? How will emerging economies forge a way forward, meaningful international cooperation? Let's once again ask our panelists. Now, Mr. Russell, you know the Bandung spirit, which is one actually started in Indonesia decades ago. Also, China proposed with many Asian neighbors present about the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So how do you see the issue of, many say, the Asian wisdom? How will that shed the light on the upcoming G20 summit discussions?
Mhm. Well, Tianwei, I think that it is human wisdom that's needed, not uniquely Asian wisdom, although it's important and valuable that not only is the ASEAN summit, the G20 and APEC in Asia, but also the COP27 meeting in Egypt is in, let's say, West Asia. And Asia has contributed and today is an immense contributor to global goods and certainly to the global economy. Look, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, the Bandung Doctrine, are the creations of another era, frankly. And I think that just taking China itself, today's China shows a very different attitude towards these ideas of peaceful coexistence, of mutual respect. The words are the same, but now I think China applies the principles very, very differently. In some ways, this is a problem.
Professor Xie, since China's name is being mentioned, please.
Maybe this is called Asian wisdom. I would think that, Mr. Russell said this is not just the Asian wisdom, it's kind of a human wisdom. We all would like to see a peaceful world, right? But I also kind of slightly disagree with Mr. Russell is that, yes, to some extent, those principles were proposed back in a very different era, to fight against hegemony in Asia. But today, the difference is that China is already a very powerful country, but China itself is proclaiming its own allegiance to these 5 principles. So I think that makes China very different. Second, an undisputable fact about China's modernization is that the Chinese has achieved its own industrialization and modernization without ever fighting a war against its neighbor and has never occupied a single country. So I think this truly makes the Chinese experience very different from many Western countries. So that's why I think, when China says we are committed to a peaceful development trajectory, many people question. I think, you can never stop people from questioning you, but I think, you can prove with your own words and the deeds that China is indeed upholding these principles.
Mr. Sugino, the Bandung spirit was specifically available to the world as a result of the role of Indonesia and, of course, other developing countries decades ago. So how do you see the so-called Asian wisdom likely to be exercised?
Bandung Spirit expressed the intention and the willingness of the countries like Indonesia not to be put in the corner, which is very difficult for us to choose on the wrong side. And this, I think, will be played again by Indonesia in the current situation. And Indonesia has already influenced the way in which ASEAN is working through what we call it ASEAN way. And of course, we have a human wisdom, which is universal everywhere. But sometimes the way they are applied or implemented are quite different from one place to another.
Mr. Singh.
Thank you. Since Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had also a great deal of contribution to both the Bandung Spirit and the Punch Shield between China and India, I think I'm happy that this is seen as symbolizing Asian wisdom. I agree with the other speakers underlining the fact that these have not been sought to be imposed on others. International relations for about last 300 to 400 years have followed Greco-Roman ethics and Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence. And if you look at in last 100 years, they have normally been articulated in terms of free market economy and liberal democracies. It is one thing to love democracy and respect democracy. It is completely another to go and impose it in Iraq or Afghanistan. I think that is where Asian wisdom stands out to be very different, where none of the countries, I love the mention of China's relationship with Russia at this moment, or India's relationship with Russia. They respect non-interference with each other's internal affairs. They respect each other's sovereignty. But there's a limit. You can't go and dictate another country how to run their affairs. And I think both China and India have shown certain amount of restraint in that regard. So, since Anglo-Saxon wisdom has run the world so far in last 200 years, and we know where we are in terms of energy crisis, climate crisis, terrorism, and so on, I think it is time to respect what is now being called the Asian moment. And I think it is time to listen to Asian wisdom. And G20 will definitely give that space to Asian wisdom. One notices that already G20, which is actually G19 plus European Union, these 19 have now 5 Asian economies that as participating, 12 economies of global South participating. So G20 is an ideal forum that showcases how the world is really becoming global and articulating wisdom of other civilizational nations. And in that sense, Asian civilization have something to contribute and is already getting that recognition. I don't think that is a matter of choice. It is only how rapidly other nations begin to understand Asian standpoints and points of views and incorporate them and find solutions together. And I just want to close my comment, but what Indian Prime Minister said while inaugurating the launching of a new platform for G20 summit meeting that India will be holding next year, he said, we want to achieve one world, not first world, not third world, just one world. And India is part of that. India has Asia has largest population in the globe. Asia is now driving the global growth rates. And I think therefore time for Asian wisdom also to become part of the global decision-making and discourses as well.
We also need to hear voices from not Asian continent, Minister Teixeira, even though you are now living in Asia, but you're from Brazil. So how do you see as an quote-unquote outsider and observer about many have been discussing recently, particularly the Asian wisdom?
If we go back a little bit, Chen Wen, 7 decades ago when the Bandung Spirit was discussed and developed, we have 6 elements that characterize that wisdom. And number 1 is decolonization. Number 2 is peaceful existence. Number 3 is multilateralism. Number 4 is equality of race. Number 5 is solidarity towards poor. And then we have development. Those elements is still debatable in the world. We still searching for a solution for every single of them. Even decolonization that we think was over, when you see the situation between Argentina and UK towards the Falklands, is still there. So I think for the last 7 decades, the world have been, I would say, fighting to overcome this problem. That's what President Xi offers when he said we need to have a shared vision of the world, meaning we need to achieve common prosperity, meaning that we need to achieve those goals that were set in the Asian wisdom. That's very important, not for only Asia, but for the world.
All right. And also, we have seen proposals being made by various governments about the global governance. China, for example, has talked about the GDI, Global Development Initiative, and Global Security Initiative.
We live in a very interesting world because we are all different. So we are not similar to each other. So, but we have to face reality. So the world will listening strong ones. So Asia getting stronger. In 25 years, Asia will produce half of the world GDP. So what is happening in Asia is that we have to understand each other. We are very different. And project, for instance, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is clearly show that Asians will come close to each other. Asian genes is genes about family, about unification, about understanding, about trust. So we're gonna get closer to each other, and together we'll be stronger, more prosperous, and we have better voice. And G20 is indeed the unique forum where Asian countries could demonstrate more or less unified and synchronous and harmonious way of communicating to the rest of the world. Asian way is not insistence, not pressure. Yeah, this is what my understanding from the deep of my heart, because I'm Asian.
Jumart Altobayev, Daniel Russell, Alessandro Teixeira, Muhadi Sugilno, Svaran Singh, and Xie Tao. Thank you. All the best. And that is our World Insight special edition on the G20 Summit with a focus on global governance and Asian wisdom. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to know more, watch World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us.